I'm Stephen Barker. I have the honor and privilege to be both the Dean of the Claire Trevor School of the Arts and also the Director of the Beale Center for Art and Technology, two of the main venues for the conference. My work consists of supporting artists and theorists and thinkers doing their work. I have a wide variety of what I call metadisciplinary background, and I'm just delighted to be able to say that the work that's being done at this conference is intended to produce really essentially a whole new paradigm of the kind of work that all of the folks at this conference are doing. We brought together a world, literally, of people who work across the notion of the relationship between the body and knowledge. You know, it's my deep understanding that the way in which for the 21st century we're going to be working across the threshold of bodies and minds, of material thought, of the way in which bodies of knowledge, both as metaphors and as actual material bodies. And so the way in which the various researchers, technicians, artists, thinkers, neuroscientists, as well as other kinds of scientists here at the conference work is going to, we hope, result in a major contribution to the way in which the body of knowledge for 21st century research into the relationship between the arts and culture in general will work. And so we're very excited to have the whole group of folks here at UC Irvine and in the Claire Trevor School of the Arts to push that agenda forward.
I'm Simon Penny. I'm the director of A Body of Knowledge, Embodied Cognition in the Arts. The theme for A Body of Knowledge comes out of my practice over the last 25 years or so. I began to struggle with what I first thought was a technical issue and then I increasingly understood was a philosophical issue about the relationship between the kind of technology I had to use and my goals as an artist. I was interested in sensory experience, and I was finding it was difficult to get the technology to perform those functions. What I called at one point the computational worldview was based on a deep belief in the separation of mind and body, or information and matter. As an artist, that idea was contrary to the way I work and perceive in the world. So this led me into a more philosophical inquiry and exploration of cognitive science and then of the new radical cognitive sciences that were then emerging in the late 80s and early 90s. Those ideas continued to inform my understanding of the relationship between computing and the art and the problems I had experienced.
I'm David Kirsch. I'm a professor at UCSD in the Cognitive Science Department. I do work now on the nature of thinking, embodied, distributed, situated cognition. I think my work intersects with the themes of the conference because it's so oriented toward understanding how we're embedded in the world, and naturally, therefore, when you're embedded in the world, you have a body oriented in a particular place, in a perspective, closely coupled to the material things around you, such as objects or representations or other people.
My name is Sean Gallagher. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Memphis, and I have a research position also at the University of Wollongong in Australia. So I came to the conference because I work on embodied cognition, and I'm very interested in embodied and activist type accounts of how we make our way through the world and perceive and remember and understand what we experience. I'm especially interested in interaction with others, so social cognition is one of the topics I work on. And it seems to me that I came here primarily to learn about how all of these different aspects play out in the performing arts, especially music, theater, dance, and so forth. I think always that it's good when you're a theorist like myself to try to find people who are actually engaged in practices that can throw some light on the phenomenon that you're studying.
My name is Evan Thompson. I am a professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. I work in the areas of cognitive science and the philosophy of mind, and I also work in areas of Asian philosophical traditions in dialogue with cognitive science and philosophy of mind. A lot of my work has had to do with the idea of embodied cognition. The approach that I've developed towards embodied cognition is called the Enactive approach. And the basic idea of the Enactive approach is that cognition is a kind of sense-making and that it occurs in and through embodied action. So the mind more generally is not something that's located in the head, it's something that involves the relationship of the whole embodied being embedded and situated in the environment.
My name is Giovanna Colombetti and I'm an associate professor in the Philosophy, Sociology and Anthropology department at the University of Exeter. So I work in the philosophy of embodied cognition, so I'm very interested in anything that relates to embodied aspect of knowledge and practices, and in particular I've been working on the affective aspects of embodiment. So I very much think that knowledge is not just embodied, but if you think of it as being embodied, is also affective.
I'm Eric Mayen. I'm a philosopher. I'm working at the University of Antwerp, and I'm interested in radical enactive cognition. Well, I think, and this conference is showing it very clearly, that the kind of dynamic approaches which have been developed in the last decades are very fruitful to investigate art as a process, art as something that is created, etc.
I'm Tony Chimero. I teach at the University of Cincinnati, where I'm professor of philosophy and psychology. I'm also a member of the Center for Cognition, Action, and Perception. The themes of the conference, The Body of Knowledge, are about the role of embodiment in the arts, and I have been focused for decades now on the idea that cognition, thinking, is necessarily embodied. And I think that relates both to the questions of embodiment and to a lot of visual art practice.
I'm Maxine Sheets-Johnstone. I'm a courtesy professor at the University of Oregon, where I taught periodically in the 1990s in the Department of Philosophy. For me, right now, the present has to do with relating being a body to the body politic. And that means showing how our interpersonal relations can be modulated by a greater awareness of our all being bodies to begin with.
One of the things that sciences and the arts have had trouble interacting is that each of them has been seen traditionally as distinct disciplinary entities with clear boundaries and with language, even though many of the terms are common, which really isn't shared. And so what we're doing at this conference is to look at the way in which neuroscience and the arts, various other sciences, including the social sciences, the humanistic sciences, medical science, but also the way in which the whole idea of scientia, Latin for knowledge, actually works as an embodied phenomenon, increasingly understood as something which cannot be defined with specific science, can develop in ways that show that the arts are central to this set of new metadisciplinary interests for the 21st century.
It became clear to me that the new paradigms of cognition, which engage the body, the world, social organization, structured spaces, and don't claim that thinking is all in the head, that these paradigms provided a way of talking about the intelligences of the arts that people in the arts have not had access to, at least for the last 100 years. It seemed very important to bring those new paradigms into interface with arts practices and arts practitioners as a way of beginning to build a new way of talking about practice, which could free itself from the illusory and rather dangerous distinction of mind and body, matter and information.
How to understand cognition as mediated by the particular media that are used in different fields, such as sculpture. How does working with the materials of sculpture constitute a kind of thinking, or painting, or dance, or music making? Working with the instruments of music, how does that comprise a type of thinking that's quite different, for instance, than speaking or working with words and propositions, which has historically been the object of inquiry when we ask questions about the nature of thought and thinking?
I think I've been interested for a while now in the project known as neurophenomenology, which is the attempt at putting together neuroscience and the typical methods of the neuroscience, brain imaging, with more phenomenological and experiential reports. And it seems to me that it would be a very interesting thing to do with arts and cultural practices. So I've been working on emotion, and lots of what is being said in the affective neuroscience, so lots of brain studies of affectivity, are about presenting people with stimuli and looking what happens in their brain when they're responding to certain stimuli, but there is not much interest in what people say about how does it feel to be exposed to a certain stimulus. And so I've been arguing in my work that we need a bit more phenomenological, experiential inquiry into our affective states if we want to really understand what goes on in the brain when we are having affective responses. So it seems to me that this is quite important if you want to do a neuroscience of the arts, because what is it to interact with arts? What is it to create a work of art? It seems to me that experience is really crucial there. So if you want to do a neuroscience of art practices, you have to explore also the experience. So it seems to me, yes, definitely one main issue is giving more space to the experiential and trying to incorporate the experiential into the more traditional cognitive neuroscientific approach.
Science and technology are returning to a notion of the way in which embodied cognition has a whole set of new meanings. And so the pertinence of what's happening at a Body of Knowledge conference is to rethink the way in which these various paradigms and paradigm shifts are working in the early years of the 21st century to ensure that across a wide set of disciplines, everybody has the chance to fully understand the kind of and the nature of the discussion that's going on among these disciplines.
As a professor, I work now with a generation of students who are born digital. They're utterly naturalized to digital technologies, but they are by the same token rather distanced from bodily practices, engagement with matter. And I see this at a very fundamental when I'm teaching, and students are really unfamiliar with manipulating matter and manipulating the real world. They're very used to manipulating interfaces and pre-designed, pre-structured systems, and feel quite helpless when confronted with raw matter, in case I'm talking about things like sculpture. And not only are they unfamiliar with engaging materiality in a raw state, their idea about how they are constituted is informed by digital computing. So when we talk about software and algorithms and information, it reinforces that in their own bodies they have a hardware-software distinction.
One of the outstanding tasks in neuroscience in general is to understand the brain as a complex and self-organizing system which has its own inner rhythms that generate activity in intimate coupling with the body as it's engaged in action with the environment. So I suppose the most general way to put that would be to understand the complexity and organization of brain processes as they contribute to brain-body-world coupling. And I think particularly arts concerned with movement practices like dance and theater improvisation, I think they provide very important windows on understanding the relationship between the embodied being and the environment and the role that movement plays in helping us understand the brain.
For me, the topic that I'm most interested in right now has to do with the microstructure of thinking. So I think that we haven't got an adequate conception of what thought is, and it's driven very much by the history of thinking as characterized by the Greeks and philosophers of manipulating propositions. But if thinking is something other than just manipulating propositions, if it involves moving your eyes and projecting imagery of some sort, or making sounds or moving a body, then a whole new set of questions arise as to how this is a form of thinking, and how do we think with new tools such as digital tools, because we form a partnership with those tools. So our mind gets extended in this partnership with tools, and as a joint form of thinking, in joint thinking with these new tools, we create new ways of thinking and new capacities to think. Think faster, stronger, more deeply than we've been able to in the past.
I think that we have had a focus in cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, on things, on products. We tend to think about perception in terms of percepts, things which are created in the head on the basis of opening our eyes. We think of imagination as an object, an internal object. And I think the important shift should take place from objects to processes. What's the most interesting thing is not how internal objects are or what their properties are, but how things come to be, what their history is, and how they come to be as they are, and how they continually change, for they continually change. Why do we perceive the way we do? And I think ultimately the answer to that question lies in some historical approach. If you transpose that change of attention to neuroscience, I think more attention should be paid to how changes at a neural level which accompany this continuous development, how these happen. For these are important components of what is the most important thing, the continuing development of processes.
The research that has most to do with embodiment and dynamics, I think has a lot to say about how artists do things in kind of real interaction with their materials and with the environment. So the idea from enactivists, philosophers and psychologists and neuroscientists and dynamical systems theorists and ecological psychologists that focuses on the real-time interaction of an individual with the material world can tell us a lot about how artists do things using their tools and how they interact with their subject matter.
Well, I think the primary issue that has also sort of arisen here in this conference has to do with methodology. How do we go about answering the questions that we're asking about cognition, and the contrast between focusing within a discipline on a particular set of questions. So if we're talking about cognitive neuroscience, neuroscientists, of course, study the brain. If they're doing just that and they are not looking outside of their discipline to work with others, academic disciplines, more theoreticians, philosophers, other scientists, but also people who are in the arts, performing arts, and so forth, they would be missing a huge part of the solution or a huge part of the story that they're trying to tell about cognition.
So in general, I think we need to have more affect, more emotion in a discourse about embodied cognition. It's important to not just talk about embodied cognition as sensory motor capacities, but also as capacity to experience things, capacities to feel. But we know now from the fields of psychoneuroimmunology or psychoneuroendocrinology that the brain continuously interacts and is modulated by the endocrine system, the immune system. There is neuronal activity going on outside the skull. So there is this incredible complexity of interactions between various aspects of our embodiment that contribute fundamentally to our affective and even cognitive states. And I think we really need to bring this to the fore, to pay more attention to this, because I think this is really challenging the idea that the basis of cognition is just all here. There is so much interconnectivity between the brain and the rest of the body that we cannot ignore it anymore.
We all have to choose the subject matter we work on, so everybody will likely say that their own research is highly pertinent. My research is on nonlinear dynamical modeling in psychology and the philosophical implications of that. But I think it's really important that cognitive science is a pluralistic enterprise, especially at the stage that it's in now. It needs lots of different kinds of theories and practices in order to kind of paint something like a complete picture of human and non-human animal behavior and thinking.
I think there are a number of research questions and programs that are of importance. I would say investigating the way that cognition is situated and embodied and how it's orchestrated through cultural practices, putting together an understanding of culturally orchestrated practices and skills, putting that together with an understanding of the brain as an embodied dynamical system.
Part of a trend of people conforming to a kind of mechanistic notion of their own selves and their own capabilities, which I think really needs to be addressed, particularly because artists must integrate their embodied practices with their intelligence. It's not possible to separate those things. When your business is shaping the material world for the bodily appreciation of other humans, to imagine that you're something like a computer with legs is very problematic.
So I think one of the challenges is how do you study social interaction where you might have more than two people interacting in a highly contextualized situation? How can you study that, and how can you do the neuroscience in that case, but also how can you integrate the kind of things you want to learn about with respect to what's going on in brains with the kind of microanalysis that might be done looking at the embodied interaction out here in the world. It seems to me it's a big challenge when you're talking specifically about social cognition.